is really an honor. I actually first met David at a poetry reading back almost 40 years ago. Known him for a while. I was at a Native Plant Society meeting where his 7th grade teacher, biology or something, came and talked with him. It was really beautiful to think that she had kind of helped shape him to move in this direction. Because he started out in '71 right here in Telluride. He was a carpenter, hung out with some friends. So he's probably as old as many of us who are old timers in this region, certainly older than I am, because I wasn't here in '71. Now he's a senior research scientist at the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship in Telluride, Colorado. He's also connected with the University of Waterloo as a professor, the Universidad Nacional Agraria de Molina in Peru, and he's also connected with, in Beijing and Chengdu, with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's really, he's an incredible guy in terms of wetlands. When you come to wetlands, not only in Colorado, but in the United States, and actually around the world, he is one of the world's experts. He's actually working on a book about Fens that I'm really excited someday. He has had 230 sponsored research grants totaling more than $13 million. David Cooper is a real scientist. Please give him a big welcome.
And in 1971, my college roommate quit college, moved to work on the first ski ranches that were being built. And he lived in the Blue Jay trailer court. For those of you who remember, he had a little tiny trailer, lived there with his wife. And I used to visit them and spend time here, you know, through the early and middle 70s, a long time. So I have vivid memories. And since then, I've worked on lots and lots of projects. People have reminded me of working on the Pearl property in the early to mid 1980s, and all the restoration projects on the golf course and ski area I worked on with Jeff and Chris. And it's been a very rewarding and interesting world. Anyway, as Art said, I'm a fanatic about wetlands. So wetlands are where water and land interact and create these seasonally or permanently saturated landscapes. And they are ecosystems that have properties and characteristics that no other ecosystem types do. And I'm not going to make a technical talk. I'm going to show you some slides. I'm sure I'll have slides with graphs on them, but I'd like to get across some pretty basic concepts about how these kinds of wetlands form and function, and tell some stories about how, working with the ski area, we actually figured out how to build ski runs amid this complex of fens so that it had no adverse impacts. Okay? Let's see, how's this work? There we go. As Art mentioned, we work on a lot of different projects. I work at Colorado State University. I have a lot of graduate students. I have 9 right now and 3 postdocs. We work on nature conservation. I work in national parks all over the world, mostly in Colorado. We work on projects dealing with hydrologic modification, groundwater pumping, ditching, all of these things that could affect natural processes and landscapes. We work on grazing projects all over the world, because in many arid regions, the wetlands are the best grazing lands. This is in the Andes, the central picture there with alpacas. And in Bolivia and Peru, wetlands are the only place these animals graze. We have big projects learning how to restore areas in the oil sands region of northern Alberta. That's that bottom left picture, where there's vast destruction of wetlands occurring. Almost 50% of the landscape being mined are wetlands, and most of them are fens. So it's a tremendous, tremendous impact. And then restoration is one of my specialties as well. We try to figure out how to put landscapes back together after they've been disturbed. And just as a note, this picture of these dead trees, this is in Tierra del Fuego, in the very southern part of South America. Beavers were introduced there in the 1950s to develop a fur-bearing population so that they could attract people to live there. They brought in 20 beavers from Canada. What do you think happened?
20,000.
There was 100,000 beavers, and they have dammed every stream. They have destroyed the whole place. I mean, it is one of the saddest stories I've ever seen in my life. Anyway, these are the kinds of projects we work on. So we're trying to figure out how to restore those kinds of landscapes that have been affected. So that's who I am. So on to wetlands. So just a very basic concept. For those of you who live in the West, I think you know this, many ecosystems in the West require a disturbance regime, right? If you live along a river, you know that floods are an important part of erosion and deposition of new landforms. And many of the key species, cottonwoods and willows, only reproduce after big floods on the bare mineral sediment. It's a key aspect. If you dam a river and stop the floods, the whole system changes. Fire regime, as you know, is critical for many forest types, and these kind of major disturbances are very important for how many ecosystems in the West work. But on the complete opposite extreme are these types of wetlands where disturbance regimes are absolutely not present. Okay, they form only where there is not a strong disturbance regime. They occur where the hydrologic regime is stable on a time scale of thousands of years. There's very little mineral influx, there's no debris, there's no flooding. Fire usually doesn't burn or kill any of the plants. And these are landscapes that I said, and I'll show you some information about this, about these sites up here, that have been stable in this landscape for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And many of the plants that live there, if you ever go up and visit these subalpine fens, these are plants that are common in like northern Alaska or, you know, the Northwest Territories or Greenland. They're boreal plants. They live in cold landscapes. When Canada was covered with ice, all these plants were down here in the United States, and since then all their habitat is fragmented. But little populations occur in these high elevation fens, and they've been there for thousands of years. And many of these plants reproduce asexually, like aspen does. They're clonal, and many of these individual plants are probably many, many thousands of years old. So the stability of these sites is an essential part of how they work. Okay, now for some kind of definitional stuff. I know many of you might know this. Some of you were on a field trip today. We actually took a field trip up to Prospect Basin, which was really fun. Only rained a little bit. We got to cruise around on a floating mat. There's a big floating mat.
Okay. Yeah, this is pretty obviously. Oh man. Wait, we got to do it together. Ready? Up. Yeah. Oh.
Oh, that is.
We're talking about a real mat.
Yeah. One of the great fens up there. So one of the main wetland types in the world are called peatlands. These are wetlands that stay wet perennially, and some of the organic matter that's produced doesn't decompose every year, and slowly it accumulates to form these big peat bodies. Okay, if you buy peat in the grocery store, at Walmart or Kmart, big bags of sphagnum, that's this kind of junk. It's accumulated by plants in soils that lack oxygen. And they lack oxygen because they're filled with water. And the oxygen from the atmosphere just can't get in there. And any oxygen that does, the bacteria use it up quickly. But because there's no oxygen, the decomposers can't really deal with all the production of moss and sedge and willow roots and leaves. So some of this accumulates on these landscapes. It's a very, very slow process, but in places like Prospect Basin, this occurs. This is a peat body. We saw one just like this today up in what we call string fen.
Soft. You know, it's a fin. Really? That's what I heard. Yeah. You probably claimed that was the ground, don't you?
Here you go. Y'all have to come over and grab it.
Wow.
Okay, so this is peat.
Giant sponge.
It's a giant sponge, that's right. Go ahead, you can grab it.
Come on, somebody else take it.
Around. Oh, it's beautiful.
Carrying a few things right now.
Or he gets to be there.
And you can see when you look at this a couple of things. First of all, the ground is covered with mosses. All of these are mosses, so they are a key contributor to the peat. And these are mosses that are common in the Arctic and boreal regions, but they're just found in these little tiny places here. The second thing is that the upper part has all this root structure formed by these sedges. So there's a couple of different species of these plants here that are all clonal. probably thousands of years old.
Clonal being asexual.
Asexual, yeah, they just like an aspen clone.
Of pollen that has come in from all the surrounding vegetation, which is then buried. Macrofossils from the plants that live there are buried, and so there's this giant repository of all of the environment that was surrounding these areas over the last 10 or 12,000 years. So these things are like a library of what our landscapes have been like. You can learn a lot about tree line fluctuations, about changes in forest composition, about which plants were living in these peatlands through time, and it's been a very important scientific topic over the years. Now, peatland isn't a peatland isn't a peatland. There's two main kinds, and everybody in the world screws them up, so I want to make sure you get it right. So these two types are bogs and fens. Have any of you heard the word fen before? I talked to a reporter yesterday or the day before. She thought a fen was a bird. So I guess it's kind of unknown. Well, fen is a word that comes from a region of southeastern England called the Fens. This is a map of it. It's a region about the size of San Miguel County, and that's a photograph of it there. And you can see it's a giant flat area. High water tables, used to be very productive sedges. Now it's all drained and converted to agriculture, but that region is called the Fens, okay? So this is how it starts. If you go to the top, after glaciation or some other disturbance, you have a lake. You may have plants. There isn't a pointer, right? So I guess I'm just going to have to wave my finger and hopefully you can figure out what I'm talking about. On the edges of the lake, you may have plants that colonize them, meaning these boreal plants that we've been talking about that are now stranded here and can float on water. And they'll gradually grow out onto the lake and fill it in and completely fill it in, like you'll see here in this middle panel. That peat body is in contact with the water table. And in most arid regions of the world, you can still accumulate peat, but it has to continue to bring the water table up with it, and it can continue to expand across the landscape. But in really humid regions like Western Ireland or other areas, Scotland, there's lots of humid regions in the world, the peat can continue to accumulate very rapidly, mostly mosses, way above the water table, so you end up with a big domed feature or raised feature. The plants that are living there don't get any of their water or nutrition from the water table, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet below them. They're getting all their water and all their nutrients from rainwater, okay? That is a bog. Bogs are what we call umbrotrophic. They're fed by rainwater, okay, and they're androgynous. So there are no bogs that occur in the western United States except for one little area on the Olympic Peninsula. So you don't have to use that word at all. You can use the term fen. Fens are groundwater-fed, peat-accumulating wetlands, okay, and they're our rarest habitat in Colorado. They contain so much of our flora. Probably 40% of all the species in Colorado, plant species, will occur in fens. And they also support most of the amphibians and lots of other species. Today we saw a population of ducks up there, and it's kind of an amazing habitat.
There are two kinds of peatlands in the world, right? There are fens, and then there are bogs, right? Those are the two main kinds. Now, bogs occur in humid regions where, as this peat accumulates, it can continue to accumulate until it's way above the water table. Okay, so it might form a big dome feature out here that might be 3 meters above the water table. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
you would find these in places like in Ireland and many other really wet, humid places in the world. The main peatlands will start as fens, but then they'll continue to build up above the water table, so that they're raised. The water table here is and the only water source is precipitation. Okay, precipitation has very, very low nutrient content, and so these are very, very nutrient poor sites, and they become dominated by these peat mosses, sphagnums. If you buy Canadian sphagnum peat in the store for your yard, those are coming from bogs. They're different. We don't know how to recreate those kinds of ecosystems, but those are completely different, and there are no bogs anywhere in this region. The climate is just impossible. We have too much drought here for the accumulation of peat above the water table.
Well, peatlands are tremendously important across the globe. They cover about 4 million square kilometers. I mean, it's a lot, and I'll show you a picture of this. It's only 2 or 3% of the Earth's area, but still, these peatlands contain almost 40% of all the carbon that occurs on Earth. Okay, so just in these small areas, most of the soil carbon is occurring in these places. All that carbon, where did it come from? Came from the atmosphere. The plants fixed it during photosynthesis, they stored it in the soil, and it's stored there. If these places are disturbed and decomposed, all that carbon goes back in the atmosphere. So the preservation of peatlands and all the carbon that's stored there is absolutely essential for the Earth's carbon budget. Okay? Peatlands are also important for regulating these other nitrogen and sulfur budgets and lots of other things, and they support huge numbers of species across the world. And in forested regions like here, these peatlands are opening in the forest, and they are spectacularly beautiful. You can see Colorado in the middle. There's a few little light areas. They think there's maybe less than 1% of our landscape would be covered with peat, which is probably right. So these fens are very rare in our part of the world. But if you go to Florida or southern Louisiana, some parts of the East Coast and the upper Midwest, Minnesota and Michigan, peatlands cover some significant areas of the world. And the biggest areas of peatlands occur in Siberia. This region here is well known as the largest peatland of the world. It's almost the size of the United States. And there's also big peat areas in Scandinavia and across all of northern Canada. So tremendous areas of peat and organic matter stored there. Well, from our favorite movie, you know, people have a very, very horrible relationship with wetlands. And most of the common terms, bog, I mean, we use these in our normal life. We're bogged down, or we're swamped, we're mired. I mean, these are negative terms. These are all wetland types, right? A bog is a particular wetland type. So is a mire, so is a swamp. People hate wetlands, and they have done their best to destroy them all over the world. And even in this movie, wetlands get a really bad name. Well, I just want to spend a few minutes and describe to you some of the processes that create the diversity of these peatlands that we have in Colorado. And then I'll talk about Prospect Basin, and then we'll end up on a different note, if that works. So why are there different kinds of wetlands? Again, a few conceptual graphs. So this is water table depth below the ground surface. The ground surface is the black line, and this is through the summer. And you can see fens, the water table is pretty much stable all the time, whereas all these other wetland types have varying hydrologic regimes, and they're dry at different times. They're pulsing and they have energy, but fens are just constant and stable. So this hydrologic difference is really important. They're of different ages as well. This is a really cool piece. So there's a map of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Each of those points are places where they aged peatlands. They took out a core to the bottom, and they did carbon-14 aging to look at when the peatland first formed. And here's a listing of all their populations. And you can see in Canada, most of the peatlands formed 3, 4, 5, 8,000 years ago. In Colorado, our peatlands are much older. So these are a lot of my dates. Those are in South Park, where most of the peatlands started forming between 9,000 and 12,000 years ago. And we have lots more dates. This is an old thing, but right here is one of the fens that we've studied up here, and we know that it is at least 10,500 years old. So these are ancient ecosystems that have been stable and performing well for a very, very long period of time. Another source of variation is because of the geologic diversity and the chemistry of the water that comes off of these different watersheds. And this was first recognized by Scandinavians in the 1940s and 1950s. And they have all of these different fen types. This is a pH gradient from 8 down to 4. So bogs are what they call moss. So they're all down here where it's really acidic. Okay, pH 4 is really acidic. It's not as acidic as your stomach acid, but it's very acidic. And then depending upon the geologic structure, the pH of the fens can be really different. And the pH affects which plants can live there, the availability of metals and nutrients. So a fen at the top and one here in the middle will have completely different species. So if you're in South Park, or if you're in the Front Range, or if you're in the San Juans, you're going to have completely different floras. So here's an example of one at the top where we're in a basin. That basin over there is marble. If you've ever been to the Dolomites of Italy or parts of the Sierras or in the Mosquito Range of South Park, that's what the mountains look like, and you end up with these calcareous peatlands, which are very distinctive. Things that are just slightly acid occur in volcanic regions like the San Juans here, like the Fens that we have. This is a site that we're working on in a big volcanic area in the Andes. Any idea how big this mountain is? I put it right there. So this peak is over 21,000 feet high, and we're sitting at about 15,000 feet. And this is a big fen right here in front of us that we've been working on. Quite an extraordinary site. Granite rocks are very prominent throughout the Sierras and Rocky Mountains and other regions of the world, but the rock is very hard and very little ions or nutrients come off of them, and they're very nutrient poor sites, but they're still fens, and those are again very, very distinctive and species poor. And the most interesting type, I think, is very common here in the San Juans, like on Red Mountain Pass, and the red is produced from iron pyrite. Right? When iron pyrite is oxidized, it's reddish like that. And when you put water and oxygen on there, it forms sulfuric acid. And the groundwater systems coming off of those are naturally acid. And you end up with acidic peatlands just like bogs. They have many of the same species, but they're fens. Okay, so there's quite a few of these around. And if you ever have a chance to see one, there's one just on the south side of Red Mountain Pass. It's called the Chattanooga Fen. It's an extraordinary natural area. You have to, if you're interested in this at all, you really need to find that site and go in there, because it is a fairyland of different colored mosses and pools and trees. It's really amazing. Okay, now you know everything about the basics, how fens work. The Prospect Bowl question is the next topic. So obviously that's where it is. I think all of you know that. On the left is what the site looked like before any development was done. And you can see there's 5 fens that have been named here. Did you name these? I think Chris Azen named these. I didn't name it Sven Fen. Somebody did who has a sense of humor, I guess. Anyway, most of these are named. It was what?
Jim Pettigrew.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. 5 fens. Cotton grass, which is named after a plant. I'll show you a picture of it later on. Cotton grasses are very distinctive peatland plants all over the world. And it's because they're sedges, but the bristles elongate into these long, feathery, cottony things, and the heads look like a big ball of cotton. And they're very characteristic of peatlands. Buckbean is also named after another plant, which floats and forms these floating mats. String is named after landforms that occur there, spruce and then sven. So the goal was, how do they build ski runs through this area and not affect this amazing complex of sites, each of which is very distinctive. They have different plants, they have different characteristics. And this is a photograph then of some of what happened. So there's a ski run up at the top. There was some trees that were removed there, and this ski run goes through Sven Fen, right where that arrow is. This landscape was removed. There was some grading done here to remove a bedrock outcrop, but this is on a divide between Buckbean and the other fens. And then there's, this one is called Cotton Grass. It's the highest elevation fen, more than 11,000 feet. And again, there's part of a ski run that goes through there. So there were several elements that went into designing this whole project. The first one is that water table stability was absolutely the most critical thing, right? You have to maintain saturation and anaerobic conditions, anaerobic meaning no oxygen in the soil, to these sites. And the key is, all of this is on this Silver Mountain landslide debris. The groundwater is moving through these very shallow layers, and my suggestion was that there be no cutting or bulldozing into the ground, which could intercept these groundwater flow paths and dry up some downstream areas. So essentially there was no ground disturbance except on that one hill. Okay, so that was a foundational piece. No overland bulldozing, no landscape changing. The second piece is that these organic sites, these peat sites, have very little mineral sediment influx to them. Okay. So the suggestion of no grading and very little land disturbance is really important, again, so that there wouldn't be a lot of mineral sediment influx, because the mineral soils are going to have lots of nutrients, there'll be eutrophication, it'll bury the plants, and a lot of these areas have mosses, carpets of mosses on the bottom. They're very sensitive to being buried by mineral sediment. The third thing was that wherever there were stream crossings, we didn't put in any culverts. There was just rocks put in there so that the stream could actually flow right through the rocks as an underdrain system. There's also an underdrain system under the parking garage. What's that called, Jeff? The big parking structure down there. The same concept was used there. That parking structure was put in an area just upstream from a big, interesting peatland. And so the way they maintained the integrity of the groundwater flow system was to build the whole thing on rocks and let the groundwater just flow completely under that parking structure. You wouldn't know it if you parked there, but that thing is permeable along the whole base. No fertilization in the basin, so even though there was some revegetation efforts, we didn't want any nutrients coming in there. And then, of course, there's the issue of the ski runs that occurred. So our work started in 2000, prior to the construction of the ski area, which then occurred in 2001. There were these post-construction studies that occurred in 2002 and 2004. We did more work there, funded by EPA in 2008, 2009, and I had a Forest Service funded climate change project, and we collected even more data up there in 2012 and 2013. We don't have anything going on up there now. So I just want to give you some idea of the kinds of data we collected and how well these recommendations actually worked out for the Fens in the midst of this recreational development. Lots of data was collected. I mean, vegetation composition. We collected sediment on these fences that were put around the edge so we could look at influx. We had these sediment plates that were put out all over the fen to measure how much sediment actually got out there. We measured soil temperature and chemistry. We made water budgets. We looked at surface water inflow and outflow. We monitored the water table in the monitoring wells, which are still up there. We measured precipitation, on and on. Lots and lots and lots of data to try to understand whether the development did or didn't have an effect and how we could deal with it. So these, as you know, the amount of water available in a watershed is really different from year to year. I think everybody knows that because you live in Telluride and snow is a giant deal. But here it can change by, so this is 1st of April snowpack water equivalent at the Lizard Head Pass gauge. And 1st of April is kind of like the end of the year max when the water's going to percolate into the aquifer and recharge it. So it's not a bad framework. These are our study years. 2000 was right about average. That dotted line is average, about 15 inches of snow water in the snowpack on 1st of April. 2000 was about average. 2001 during the construction was below average. 2002, which is our first test year, was like the worst year in the history. The only lower snowpack than 2002 was 1977, all over this region. So that was a great first year. We thought, wow, the fens are all dying. But we know that it was a low snow year. We expected there to be a problem. And in the next 2 years, the snowpack was kind of a little back to average. The really interesting thing about the San Juans is this two-pronged precipitation regime. You have the winter precipitation, but you also have a very strong monsoon that hits the area, and you know the biggest precipitation months of the year are July, August, and September, which is kind of surprising for most people. But this provides the snow, which can saturate the fens, but then these fens occur in very small watersheds, and they always run out of water, and the water table starts to drop, and then it starts raining, and up they come. So having both of these precipitation regimes, winter and summer, that coincide and are linked together is absolutely essential for the way these things have functioned. Okay, just a little structure here. So this is the highest site. And what we did, this is an outline of it, and let's just look at that top cross-section. So that's a cross-section of the top, and I had this crazy student who worked 24 hours a day, I think, and he went around with it was Chris Arp with his long rod, and he would poke all the way down to the mineral soil at the bottom, and he recorded this in these transects, and he developed this whole bathymetry of these sites so we could look at the shape of them and how much peat was in them. Each of those dots are trees that he hit while he was probing.
Wow.
So these things are full of trees that are falling in. That yellow line you see at the top was a core that Chris and Pat Drew and I took out, and we took 3 pieces of that and we had them carbon dated. The bottom, as I mentioned, was almost 10,500 years old. It's probably not the oldest part of that site, but we know that these are ancient ecosystems. Even more interesting, the second dot, 9,635 years, was a tree that we went through with our core. It cut right through it, and you could still see the rings in this spruce tree. 9,600 years old. It was kind of an amazing fossil to have. I wish I kept it, but I sent it off to a lab and they burned it to give us an age. But ancient systems, they kind of all started in these little basins. I keep missing the button. For those of you on the trip today, you know that this is the most interesting of all the fens. I'll show you a picture of it at the end. It's called buckbean because of a species that occurs in there. It has 3 leaves like a clover, but it has these beautiful white fringed petals. It's an amazing plant that floats. It can float on the water and form a floating mat. So the way this site has formed is that it's in probably what used to be a lake that probably was about this deep. You can see there's a hump there going downhill, and the lake was probably this deep. The plants colonized on the side and filled it in, and as they filled it in, the water table got deeper and deeper, and the peat spread to the side and allowed the lake to get higher. So this site now has almost 15 feet of peat in it. So way more than this. A gigantic amount of peat that has accumulated probably over the last 10 or 12,000 years. So it's accumulating peat at about a rate of 1 foot per 1,000 years. Really slow. So next time you go to the store and you buy a bag of peat, you really need to think, what the hell am I doing? Because this stuff is ancient. Now, there's no more peat mining in Colorado. That stopped some years ago. Most of the peat you buy is from eastern Canada. And they're mining these true bogs, which are now getting to be quite rare in eastern Quebec. Anyway, these sites formed from open lakes. They've colonized and formed, and they're not quite filled in yet. But this site has this floating mat where I have the little thing there. And if you ever get a chance to go up and walk on the site, it's the most amazing experience because it is actually floating over the water. As you can see here, the plants are buoyant, and there's water underneath it, and the whole thing is just this floating thing that's held together by the roots of the sedges and the mosses and this buckbean that lives there. It's kind of an amazing place. Lots of hydrologic information, which I'm not going to go into, but we used monitoring wells and flumes to try to get a handle on the water levels here. Lots of details. We had loggers in some of these to measure the water table hourly. This is one of the sites, and you can see some of the instrument stations there. Most of these were measured by hand by Telski staff, to whom we're forever indebted. This is a site called Spruce Fen because there's spruce trees growing right out in the middle of the peat. Everybody thinks that spruce trees can't grow in wet areas, but they do. We saw it today. Lots and lots and lots of them. And then we had these flumes at the end. Anyway, just a couple of data graphs here just to sort of show you what's going on. This is the year 2000, the very first year we were monitoring, and these are the water levels. Each of those traces is one well, one of those monitoring wells, which is measuring the height of the water table relative to the ground surface. 0 is the ground surface. All the lines you see at the bottom, the vertical lines, are rainfall events in millimeters on the right scale. Okay? So what you can see is the water level stayed fairly stable until almost the middle of July. There was a few rainstorms there that kept it up, but then there was no rain and the aquifer ran out of snowmelt water and the water table just dropped very sharply, and it stayed down until the middle of August when the monsoons occurred and then came right back up to the surface again. If the water table drops more than 15 centimeters below the surface, the upper part's not really going to be saturated anymore. Okay, there'll be some capillary water, but it won't be anaerobic, which is what you need to preserve the litter and keep the peat accumulation going. So A short period like this is probably not too bad. Here's another year, same scale. What do you notice about this? These are 4 different wells, one in each of the 4 main wetlands. It rained a lot more, didn't it? Yeah, the water table never really got very far down. As soon as it did, it started raining. So, you know, the aquifer never really pooped out of water. This was an average water year, but plentiful monsoon rains really drive the hydrologic regime of these sites, which is kind of amazing. This has never been reported in the literature before. There's lots of evidence of the monsoon supporting pinyon forests and lots of other forest types, but wetlands, I've never heard of it, at least not in North America. It's important in India. And then here's a 5-year picture. This is our first monitoring year after the ski area was built, and you can see the water table dropped feet below the surface, and everything really dried up. And it hardly rained that summer, and there was very little snow. But then the next 2 years, 2003 and 2004, were perfect. You know, there was average snow, average rain, and everything worked just fine. So this gave us an idea that hydrologically everything was working just fine. In 2008, we came out again and did more monitoring, again, more lines. I know you don't have to worry about those, but in this year, again, the water table stayed really high. This was a very, very large snow year, 2008, at least for the April snowpack. And you can see the snow lasted all the way into August before it really started to drop off. And these are important things to think about. And again, another study showed again. So hydrologically, these things are intact. The ski area development didn't really change any of the flow paths significantly enough to change the driving forces that allow these things to persist. I'm not going to go over this. This is just mineral sediment flux, and we measured this and quantified it. And again, there was no change from 2001 through our project with mineral sediment flux. So there was really nothing going on. So the landscape changes that the ski area made were really quite gentle. So this is an example of one of the places. This is a ski run, and you can see the trees were removed. The landscape is really very rough. It's not smooth like the old-timey ski areas that were bulldozed. The big boulders, like that one there, and there's one here, were just broken off, just so they wouldn't be obstructions. But it was kind of a design with nature concept, and the skiing is quite a bit more challenging. And here's another example where, because grading would have hurt the fens, the ski area didn't do it. This is right at the bottom of, what ski run is this one? This is at Fens? Stella? Yeah. You come down here, you go across this fen, so this right part here is a ski run, the left is not, and you have to come up this hill. And the hill really slows you down. In the old days, they would have just bulldozed that hill right off. It probably would have drained the fen and killed it. But in this development scenario, there was none of that done, and the landscape was left to be intact. Okay. So the next story I want to talk to you about is the only thing that may be going on here that may be detrimental, and I'm not even sure if it's detrimental, is that the snow that we get in this part of the world is very light and forms a blanket over the ground, and it insulates the ground and keeps it warm, right? In many of these areas, the ground never freezes all winter. And these fens are fed by groundwater, which is moving up through the peat to the ground. It's fairly warm, and so the peat soils just don't freeze. They haven't frozen probably for thousands of years. But when you compact the snow, all of a sudden it conducts cold down into the ground, and the ground can freeze. And we noticed this because, as you can see in this picture, this was brown and that was green. It took a long time for this to green up because the ground was so much colder. This is in cotton grass fen as well. You can see the ski run is there. It took weeks longer for the area to green up in the ski run than outside the ski run. Here's a little bit of data, and I'll just spend a minute on this. The blue line is the ski run, and the green is the natural area, and you can see there's the 0 line. This is, I forget what year, 2002 or 2003, and you can see the natural area levels out about 1 degree Celsius, whereas the other one froze, and it stayed frozen until almost July. And so there's this big gap in temperature of the soil that is really hard to make up through the season. Does it really affect anything? I don't know. This is an interesting question. It may not. it may catch up. But this could be one of the things that we really need to pay attention to in the future. I think I've covered that enough. Anyway, just to talk about these in a broader sense, I think the development of the ski runs in Prospect Bowl didn't really cause any change in hydrologic regime or water levels, or mineral sediment flux, the chemistry or other variables, certainly not the vegetation. Many new concepts were used in the development of the ski runs to accommodate the persistence of these peatlands. Many of these recommendations were forwarded by the committee. We talked about these: no cuts into potential aquifers, no grading, which could liberate a lot of mineral sediment, no filling, etc. The key here is this two-pronged hydrologic regime. That is something that I had never really thought about and that we really need to think about in the future. I just want to touch on this real quickly. I've got a few slides. It's a little technical, but I want you to think about it because it's something that could be done by the community to continue the monitoring in the Fens. Monitoring the hydrologic regime is really easy. It's all set up. We can show you how to do this. To measure carbon sequestration, or really the carbon budget of these sites, and determine whether they're still accumulating peat, is really the pulse of how these sites function. And we know how to measure this. I'm going to show you how to do it, and I'm hoping that some of you will want to take this on as a project for the next 20 years. Because I'm not going to do it. I'd like to do it, but. Okay, so the way it works is, you know that green plants photosynthesize, right? Their carbon source is carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so they bring that in, they fix it, and we can measure that, and that's gross ecosystem production. So that's carbon coming out of the atmosphere and into the plants, okay? We also know that there's respiration. The plants are respiring to live just like we are, and their microbes in the soil are respiring, and so there's carbon dioxide being released. And the difference between production and respiration is this net. And that's what we want to find, because if that net is positive, it tells us that there's more carbon being stored than being released. Okay? And that's the sign of a functioning fen that can last for thousands of years, and that's what's been going on there. And we measure this using a clear chamber and what's called an infrared gas analyzer. The infrared gas liner, which is that little tiny white box that costs $8,000 in that guy's hands. You don't want to drop that thing in the water. A very sensitive measurement of carbon dioxide in this chamber. So we have fans that move the chambers around, and if you put it over living plants in the light, would you expect the concentration of carbon dioxide in that chamber to go up or down? Down? Yeah, you'd expect it to go down because the plants are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right, from the chamber. So that rate of carbon change in the chamber is the rate of fixation that we can measure, right? So we can actually measure that. Then we cover the chamber with a light-proof cloth. We stop the photosynthesis, and then we're measuring what's going on in the chamber and what will be going on in the chamber then. Carbon dioxide will be increasing because of respiration. And it's the difference between gross primary production and respiration that gives us the net ecosystem exchange, okay, which is the net that we want to know about. And you know, it turns into a pile of data like this. This is respiration measurements in 2003 and 4. This is at just one site, Buckbean Fen. These are photosynthesis measurements, and those are the nets. And you can see the nets are above zero, which tells us that on an annual basis, we can create models of this as well, that this site is still accumulating peat. It's healthy. Okay, this is, in my view, the water table depth and this net ecosystem exchange are the most important things to measure long term to understand the health of these sites. And Rod just put this together. I'll just touch on it, but you can see the highest rate of production of net ecosystem exchange is when the water table's close to the surface and the air is warm. So the peak summer, when the plants are really photosynthesizing at their max, that's when things are really happening. I had a student work here in 2012 and 2013, and he did these carbon measurements on peatlands across the Rocky Mountains. These are 4 of the sites he worked at. And the ones with the green arrows are one of the fens up here. And if you look at the net ecosystem exchange, which is the black part, he measured it in 2 different communities. It's pretty significant. It's the highest of any of the sites that we've seen, and so these sites in these years were accumulating peat and doing quite well. So they're very stable in this current climate regime. So to scale this up, you need to make these measurements. You need to have some instruments out there that can measure energy, because the energy is what drives photosynthesis. And we can measure water table, we can measure a variety of other things, including soil temperature, and using those variables, you can build a model of this carbon sequestration, which is really useful to have. We've never measured methane gas from these. As you know, methane is a very important greenhouse gas. Be useful to do. This is an example of some of the cores and analyses that people have done to look at the history of vegetation of the sites. This is from a different part of the San Juans, but you can see major changes in the width of the black lines and major vegetation going on. Well, I think everybody except our president has heard that climate change is occurring. If you've ever been to Glacier National Park, you know that there's only 25 glaciers left of the 150 that were there when the park was established. They're predicting that by 2050 there will be no glaciers in Glacier National Park. Probably have to have a new legislation to change the name of the park to, it once had Glaciers National Park. Or something. We've been working there, it's really interesting. But these same processes are occurring all over the region. I mean, the climate is changing, and we're unsure how it will affect all the ecosystems that we're interested in. So one of the things, again, that would be worthwhile to do as a citizen project or a professional project here is to kind of follow precipitation, its timing, the snow melt, its timing, and really try to get a handle on it. Nationally and globally, there's a huge phenological network to show that most of these plants are flowering earlier and earlier and earlier, and that would be another really interesting study to do, particularly of some key species, and then there's lots of key plants to measure. And these are some of the species I was telling you about. This is buckbean. This thing right here, it's got these 3 thick leaves, very, very fat roots. It can transport a lot of gases down into its roots. It has these beautiful fringe petals. Minianthes, that's right, Minianthes trifoliata, 3 foliate leaves. These are 2 species of cotton grass here. This is the one that's up in the fen and cotton grass fen. It's called Eriophorum altaicum. It's kind of a Rocky Mountain endemic. It's not known in very many places in Colorado. And that little thing up in the top left is Carex limosa. It's the most important floating mat plant that has probably been up there for 12,000 years building these peat bodies. One other site I want to tell you about. There's a peatland over by the Durango Mountain ski area that we found a few years ago. And it's got these really interesting plants in them. Rincospora is something that hasn't been known in the western United States, and this is a sundew, which wasn't known in the western United States, south of Yellowstone before. Sundews are meat-eating plants, which are very common. Lots of support for this project over the years, and we thank everybody, the county and the town of Telluride, Mountain Village, Durango, Forest Service. We've gotten funding and help from so many different organizations. So if you want, I was going to show you a few slides of a few other fens around the world just to entertain you. It'll just take 1 second. And I've just had the opportunity to be working in China and then all over the Andes and many other places. And I just wanted to show you a few other fens and what they look like, just so you can be at least entertained. This is the most common fen type in the central Andes. This is in Bolivia, where the 3 people are walking, and there the main plants are these giant cushion plants. They're flat. They grow up as almost like trees. They can be 5 to 7 meters long. Gigantic peat accumulation systems, and they all look like these plants. They're together in there, and they make little dams and dam up the water. So these cushion plant peatlands are really common in the southern hemisphere, to say the least. Other parts of Peru are working in some of these areas, and in Peru, almost all the peatlands are ditched, like you can see in the bottom left corner there. And I just wanted to show you this photograph of this plant. This plant is occurring at almost 15,000 feet. It has the largest flower stalk of any plant in the world. This is Puya ramondii, and it's giant. It's like 5, 6, 7 meters tall, and it's living at almost 4,000 to 5,000 meters high in the Andes. And it supports the world's largest hummingbird, which is bigger than a robin. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. And it lives right on the edges of these peatlands. The big deal in the Andes is that there's no snow, there's no winter, it's tropical, and there's grazing 365 days a year. And these peatlands are getting massacred, just absolutely devastated. They're falling apart. This middle picture, that peak to me almost looks like Mount Sneffels in the background there, but those cows are grazing at 15,000 feet. So they're pretty tough cows. Most of the rest of the grazing in that part of the Andes is from llamas and alpacas. And there's lots of climate change, and many of the peatlands have just completely dried up. Lots of dead sites. This top photograph is a big floating mat complex in Colombia, in the northern part of the Andes. And it's a different climate there. It's much more humid, and the peatlands are much larger. Here's an area in Tibet where we've been working. Yak grazing here. You can see a giant fence line contrast with grazing on the left and not on the right. And this fen extends all the way to those mountains you can see in the distance. Wow. Huge area with hundreds of square miles of peatland on this flat area at about 14,000 feet. Most of these areas are national parks, whatever that means in China. It doesn't really mean anything. People own the land and they graze it, but the flora here is absolutely stunning. Several species of edelweiss. If you've been to the Alps, you know edelweiss is just on the top right. Saucerias, and lots of species of gentians and lots of other plants. And anyway, I just wanted to end with this. This is one of my first students getting to the bottom of things. And we were working on a site in Sequoia National Park, and this stonemason was just amazing. No ear protection, no eye protection, smoking a cigar. This guy was amazing. I just couldn't believe it. Anyway, that's all I have. I hope you got something out of this.
So we'd like to follow up now with a little bit of a discussion of the restoration work that was done on the golf courses. Some of you who've been here many years know that when the ski area first was built, they built their golf course. They did it by just bulldozing in and covered up a number of fens, and it got reported to the EPA, and it was a violation. There was a big fine, and so we started out with a real disaster here. But what's the really Cinderella story part for me is that after working with David Cooper, who was actually a consultant for the EPA, but luckily our Telsky folks hired him over to their side instead of their consultants, who they fired or let go. And because of David and because of Telsky, and we have Chris Hazen, Pat Drew is here, they all worked a whole lot on this. So I was hoping they would come up and talk a little bit about what it was like, because nationally, the EPA is now using Telluride as an example of how to do it right, how to do the restoration right, what the political process was, how the changes happened, so that if, rather than making a mistake in the beginning, you can start out doing it well. They're using the system that was created here by these folks in order to kind of make restoration happen all over the country. Please, come on up, Jeff and Chris and Pat. Come on, David. You guys all just need to talk a little bit about what happened there. Come on, Pat. Where's Pat? He was here. I saw him.
Oh, he
must have walked out.
Well, yeah, I think I'll start by saying that it's been interesting that I think in the last 2 years or 3 years, I think there was a girl from France that called up and wanted to do a research project on these wetlands. And they're on the golf course. It's kind of hard for people to be going out and collecting data while we've got golfers hitting right over the top of them. But we were able to make it work. So we've had that one, and now just recently these two other gentlemen from your grad program, I think, they're doing a research project there. So it's gratifying for us, and I think that what Art had said is kind of the key for us. I was sitting in a room down in Denver with a lot of high-paid lawyers, and just thinking about how much money we were spending just talking about who's a consultant was going to do what. And I finally looked at Ron Allred and I said, and we always thought that, there would be differences between what the EPA's consultant would think, what our consultants would think, and we'd go through that whole process. I think the big decision we made was, why don't we just hire Dr. Cooper to be our consultant, and then we won't have those issues to deal with. So, and it was kind of a risk, because I, being involved in more engineering and landscape architecture, I'm used to working with engineers and architects and not ecologists, and so there's kind of a different way, or a touchy-feely way of doing things when you're working with a scientist as opposed to working with engineers and architects and that kind of thing. So I didn't quite know how that was going to work, so we took a chance, but I have to say it really worked well. And if anyone ever gets into a project like this, bring in a scientist, bring in an ecologist, and engineers are really useful for a lot of things, but when it comes down to restoring wetlands, I think that a key thing is to have the right people involved. Some of the things that we did that were really interesting and fun and successful, and it really ended up, although it was painful in the beginning, and it ended up really being a great fun project for us, all the wetlands. Those of you that live down in Meadows, I know there's some of you here, that used to be a huge parking lot and a big pond. And it's now wetlands, and there's beaver ponds, and there's creeks and everything. That was all a restoration project. So that's really the positive outcomes that have come out of this. We've created a really awesome environment for people to live in. It's back to what it should have been in the first place. But some of the things that we did that were really important is we collected all the seed for all the plants on site. We didn't buy plants from nurseries, and you really can't when you're doing wetland restoration. You have to really basically collect your own seed and hire people to propagate, grow the seed, and then plant the seed. We did stem cuttings. We built greenhouses and did stem cuttings, and collected all the stem cuttings of various willows and different types of plants that would be planted into the wetlands. We collected seed from alders and just everything, and it was really based with David's direction on how to go about doing it. But I think that was really what made it a success. That's why now people are coming here and want to do research projects on these wetlands, because everything worked well. And I think it was somewhat simple concepts, David. I don't know if you would agree with that. I think it was really,
Chris was there the whole time.
yeah, and I want Chris to talk about how we dealt with the stratification and building these things, and again, using the simple concepts. You might want to go into some of the actual taking the fill out and how we got back to the old wetland restoration grades. I think that was another concept that was important.
Jeff's being pretty humble too. He, he's really the guy that brought kind of common sense to the solution to the problem. He was able to gain Ron's trust through a lot of good years working, and really convinced Ron that this was the right approach. And they had signed and sealed the consent decree prior to Jeff hiring me, and I think that's kind of the silent partner in the deal, because there was this ironclad deal that every page had RA in the corner signed. Ron committed to this program, and for those of you that have been here, you know that money was not always, there wasn't a capital faucet that was wide open up on the hill. And Ron put the money up, and he really trusted Jeff to make good decisions, and obviously hiring Dave was the best move that we could have come up with. So Jeff hired me. I was handed a playbook. Here's the rules. Here's the reporting schedule. It's by every day. Next morning by 8 a.m., if we miss a deadline, we get to pay a fine. So it was, you were working under a guillotine. And David wisely counseled us to pick the low-hanging fruit early, and we took on the easy projects. So the first one occurred 20 years ago, and it was right behind Fairway 4, and it's the fourth tee box that used to sit down in the willows. It was the ladies' tee, and it was fill that got pushed in on a wetland, and it came out. And grade was there, and plants were there, and buried willows, and so that kind of set the tempo for the next projects as we got into deeper project planning exercises and drawing of designs and coming up with planting schedules, we had to really kind of fine tune the thinking cap, because David knew what not to do, but we didn't really know for sure what to do. So we started employing techniques like exposing cross sections through sites where we knew there was fill, but we really had no idea how deep it was. We began to expose layers of buried historic grade. We were able to see stratification in these trenches where you could clearly identify that fill native ground line, and that kind of became the target for all of our sites, because the hope was, and there were no guarantees, but the hope was that if you could put the land surface back to that original grade, that the water table would follow if it hadn't been tweaked too badly upslope, which unfortunately it was a bunch of miners that did this work, and they're really creative and really tenacious, and if they want to dry something out, they're going to do it. So they had drains everywhere, pipes. I mean, it was an amazing kind of sleuthing chase to find these drains and eliminate all of the features that were dewatering these wetlands through time. And 15 projects, including the valley floor, 40 plus acres of restoration. Obviously, it cascaded into really sound planning for the prospect expansion, and really created a great partnership with David. I certainly would know about that much if I hadn't met this guy a long time ago. I can accredit him with all the Latin I know. So,
Well, let's see if folks
Yeah,
have some
if there's some
questions.
questions.
Yeah, and David, come on up, because people here may want. Please, Angela.
I was just curious, did your golf course designer learn anything over this process?
I don't know that it was really the golf course designer that really caused all the problems in the first place. I think that a lot of golf course designers will learn from this and have learned from it. And I was going to say that the golf course is better for all this too. It really creates a nicer feeling when you're going and playing on the golf course. It is, there's more what they call in the golf business carry holes, where you have to get over wetlands and those kinds of things. But part of playing golf needs to be enjoying those natural ecosystems like the wetlands. So I do believe there are some golf course architects that really do agree with kind of preserving those kinds of things. The golf course architect, I don't know that, I think there was other people involved, contractors and whatnot, that got a little overzealous.
One of the nice things that's really important about this is that originally the thought was to do a restoration in Montrose, and that was the original thought from the company. So again, this entire process is interesting because the EPA said no, and the county fought it, and yet when they did do it here, they did a really good job. And so I think it's really instructive, rather than trying to push as a developer, trying to push your problems onto somewhere else, to really deal with the site itself. And I think that's why this is a model, because it shows exactly how you can do it the right way.
And it was done while the course was open too.
The cheapest way to do restoration is to do it right the first time.
Yeah.
Because if it fails, you got to start over.
And and on that note, there were reference sites that we used as models that we had to match in order to have success criteria, so that we could say that we met the requirements of the consent decree. So we couldn't just make things up. There were very strict criteria and thresholds that we had to meet to basically get the chains off and be free of the consent decree. And with David's help and Chris's help, we were able to do that. It was rigorous and a lot of sleepless nights.
Please.
So, have you guys documented this or with slides? Because it would be really interesting to hear you talk for 15, 20 minutes with some before and after, and here's what we did, and here are the trenches, and here's the criteria. Just like take this to like the level of, let me show you the model project.
It's interesting she said slides, because that's what we do now, is slides.
You do.
Nowadays, you can just take
Now it's all digital.
autographs. I wish we would have had it, because it would be on my phone and I could have just plugged it in.
So Jeremy and Andrea, that just came here and gave the earlier talk 2 weeks ago, they actually did a study of what happened at the golf course to see if how much changes actually occurred. So
They're doing it.
they're doing it. So they did this, a lot of the testing, but they're going to do the work. And we'd like to bring them back. So that would be a perfect time to do something like
And we
that.
could do something like that. We really are just adding this on to David's talk about the fence today, but I know I have those slides somewhere. You probably have a bunch of slides.
When you say the trenches, it's like, I would love a visual.
Yeah,
of what you're
it's-
talking about.
Yeah, we had
We have
no
lots of
less
those.
than like a dozen trenches through hole 6. Like that whole area on the right,
Oh,
if
yeah.
you know the course.
That was a mess.
Yeah, there were some tricky sites.
And we brought in a contractor too that was, both Chris and I had known for many years, and he was actually, had been in the golf course construction bit, and he had a real soft touch with big equipment, large equipment, to be able to make some of this work, because it's really tricky to get back to those grades. I mean, it's very, very tight numbers when
Well,
you.
I presented this restoration concept all over the world, so I've got lots and lots of slideshows that are already put together.
Great.
So that would be easy. Or
Couple
we
more-
can have another workshop in the field.
That would be good too. A couple more questions?
As a visitor, what would be the term of the area that's west of Telluride all the way to that second roundabout, that area that's been preserved recently? Is that
Valley
a
floor?
Call it the Valley Floor.
Valley floor?
But
Is
it was
that a
originally known as
fen?
San
Is
Miguel
that a-
Park, yeah.
Is that a fen? Is it a wetland? What is that?
It's a wetland, it's not a fen. I mean,
Okay.
there's one part of it might be a fen.
There's a
It's-
peat line.
Yeah.
And
It's
there's been,
mostly what we call riparian areas, so it's a stream that interacts, floods, and.
Was it a tarn that filled up?
Well, right down there where the roundabout is a terminal moraine, so there's a lake.
Yeah.
What's a terminal marine?
Yeah, it was a terminal moraine, now it's mostly gone, yeah. People mine terminal moraines. But yeah, it was a giant lake, which is really common in valley bottoms like this. The lake could have been 300 or 400 feet deep. But as the glaciers melted, it just filled that whole thing in and created that flat area. They're very characteristic of the Southern Rocky Mountains, that landform.
and part of it ended up being one of our restoration sites. We didn't have enough area on the golf course to fulfill all the requirements we needed for acreage. And so there was an alluvial fan where Prospect Creek came down over the ridge and came into the valley floor and created this alluvial fan. And years ago, the mining company came in and dredged it. And so there were these huge trenches and great big dredge marks. And Ron Allred knew about these and suggested when we came up short on our acreage that he negotiated with San Miguel Valley Corporation, which is another difficult process. It was successful, and we were able to get roughly 20 acres of wetland restoration there by restoring the alluvial fan on the valley floor. And Hillary was here, I don't know if she's still here, but there was a project this year that restored part of the river on the valley floor, so there's a lot going on there now to do restoration. It's had some rough times, but it's got a lot of, there's a lot of things there that are really positive, and there's a lot of opportunity there as well.
And I think it's one of the reasons why it's a model, because there was a lot of political process with real estate trades. There was a lot of things that moving parts that had to be done in order to make this really work here. And that's really why we're so proud of what's happened. Two last questions, and then we probably should end. All right, well, thank you all very much. Thanks, David Cooper, David,